It's a new ski wax stand where the supports are all made of wood. It's lightweight, made out of maple, which is more sustainable than steel, and it's more interesting to build than simply building on top of a commercially built sawhorse. Here's how I built it. I've built 3 different waxing stands, and each of them has been an improvement on the previous version, but they've all been mounted on top of a sawhorse that I had to buy. The lighter, cheaper sawhorse is only $20 on sale, but it's not as sturdy as the more expensive model, which now costs almost $120. My mission for this wax stand design is to build a stand out of wood so that I don't have to buy a metal sawhorse. I started the process in SketchUp. I wanted the legs to be able to fold up so that the stand didn't take up much space to store, but this is trickier than I first thought. The legs need to be parallel to the body of the stand when it's folded up, but they need to spread out when they're unfolded so that the stand is stable. That meant putting an angle on the leg where the bolt for the leg connects to the body, and the same angle has to be on the body so that the legs fold flush. You can see that this wedge here is at the same angle as the angle that's on the face of the leg. This angle was completely arbitrary, but made the stand sturdy without the legs being too wide and getting in the way when you walk around the stand. 9 degrees ended up being about right in the final build, so I guess I got lucky. To put a 9-degree angle on the top of the leg, I marked the angle in pencil and then did multiple passes with a small hand plane to remove the wedge of wood. After that, the hole was drilled for the bolt so that it was perpendicular to the 9-degree face. The final design ended up changing a lot from this first design, but the concept of the angle on the leg matching the angle on the body that was developed in SketchUp remains. With this sketch of a design, I headed to the shop to start building, but as I started to work through the build, I realized that attaching the leg to the body would involve bolts hidden under wedges, which was going to be complicated to assemble and impossible to service if anything went wrong, so I quickly changed the plan to have the legs attached differently. I went through a few different designs and did several builds and wasted a ton of time on these. I finally settled on one that seemed to work pretty well. I refer to this piece as the saddle. It requires the 9-degree angled faces for the legs to attach to, and the bolts for the legs have to be perpendicular to the angled face. The bolt holes also have to have countersinks to hold washers between the leg and the body. This turned out to be something where following a very specific order of operations can simplify the process a lot. In this case, the bolt holes and the countersink holes are drilled at 9 degrees before the angles are cut on the saddle. In order to attach the legs, I have to get a nut on the end of the leg bolts. In my first designs, I was trying to be all too clever using small holes for first a desk bolt, and then a slightly larger hole for a regular bolt, but none of these really worked out well, so I ended up drilling a large hole in the center of the saddle instead, and this left lots of room for fitting a nut and washer to the leg bolt. Once the legs are attached, there also needs to be a way to stop the legs from opening too far. In the initial design, that functionality was provided by the block at the end of the body, but in the final design that I built, the leg lock is provided by an angled piece of maple that's attached to the bottom of the saddle. Getting the angled leg lock in place turned out to be kind of tricky. The angle had to exactly match the angle that the leg meets it when it folds out, and it has to be perfectly square so that both legs open the same amount. As you can see in this build, where the leg lock isn't exactly square, so the legs fold out to different points, and the whole saddle assembly doesn't sit flat. I eventually switched to using a round leg lock, which meant I didn't have to guess at the correct angle to cut the leg lock on. The body of the stand is 4 feet long, and it's made out of 3/4 maple and cherry glued together. It could have been just maple, but the two woods look nice together. When I finished the build, I noticed that it flexed a lot when the stand was set up and I was working on a ski, so I added an extra strip of maple to the bottom to make it more rigid. I screwed this extra spine onto the body so that I could remove it, if necessary, to access the mounting bolts underneath. At this point, the saddle is complete and the legs are attached to the saddle. The leg lock's in place so that the legs don't open too far. The saddles are then mounted in two different ways so that the legs can fold into the body of the stand without running into each other. One is mounted on the bottom of the body, and the other is attached at the end of the body in the same plane as the body. This makes the height of the top of the legs different so that when they're folded up, one set of legs rests on top of the lower set. So far, so good. In theory, the stand will work this way. However, as soon as you press down on the ski that you're waxing, the legs want to spread out, and you don't have a very firm platform to work on. There's also a risk that the legs might actually break. To address this problem, I realized that I had to add a diagonal brace to the legs. The first plan was a brace that folds up when the stand was closed and unfolds and locks in place when the stand is set up. While the folding strut worked, it was awkward to store and a lot of effort to make. I decided a solid strut was a better idea. The next challenge was how to attach the strut to the legs so that it offered the needed support. I tried a few different things, but settled on adding a cross brace to the legs and attaching that strut to the center of the cross brace. To make the bracket that attaches the strut to the cross brace, I started with a block of wood and ran it through the stacked dado on the table saw, and then cut off the length that I needed for the bracket. Then I rounded it off a bit on the belt sander. I drilled a hole through the bracket that's the diameter of a 1/4 inch pin. This provides a firm connection for the strut to the legs. When I got to this point, I ran into another problem. Because the legs open out on an angle, the faces of the legs, where the cross brace is attached to them, those faces aren't parallel. They're angled, so attaching the cross brace wasn't working very well because it couldn't sit flat against those faces. The result was that I had to go back and recut the legs so that instead of having a rectangular cross section, they're actually parallelograms. With this change, the cross brace was now able to lay flat on the faces of both legs, as you can see in the video. It's also worth noting that on my first build, I made the legs 3/4 of an inch square, but those legs were too flexible, so I increased them to 1 1/4 inches by 3/4, which were more rigid, but also complicated the bolt placement on the top of the leg. The holes had to be offset so the legs could still fold together nicely, one on top of the other. The last thing that I needed to make the struts work was to attach them to the body of the stand. To do this, I made a small bracket that would attach to the body. In later builds, I realized that I could connect them directly to the spine and save space and effort. So that's all the bits and pieces of building the stand. On top of the stand, I put the folding ski supports that I built in another video. You can see that link in the description below. It's now time to do some testing. That's when things went wrong again. The force of pressing down while waxing a ski resulted in 3 things happening. The bracket that held the strut to the cross brace split, the strut broke, and one of the cross braces came loose. I don't know what order these things happened, so cause and effect is hard to determine. But my solution was fairly simple. I cut a new strut and rebuilt the bracket using maple this time instead of cherry. I attached it to the cross brace with only 1 screw rather than 2, so that would hopefully make the wood a little bit stronger. It wouldn't be weakened by having 2 holes in it. And then under testing, it held up just fine, so I'm blaming the cherry bracket until proven otherwise. That was the end of the building adventure. Many mistakes were made and many lessons were learned as a result, but when it's all put together, I've ended up with a wooden ski wax stand that is lightweight, sturdy, and easy to set up. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. It's winter here today and ski season isn't far behind. Happy skiing, happy ski waxing, enjoy the winter. Thanks for watching.